Hi, everybody. So we're back for another week of Poly 130, and this week we're going to be talking about a very sobering topic. We're actually going to get into talking about ethnic violence and ethnic conflict by focusing on some individual cases. So I'm going to put a general trigger warning on this lecture. There will be some pretty gruesome images. And we're definitely going to be talking about a topic that's not much of an upper. Um, but hopefully I'll try to keep the lecture pretty informative, and factual, so that it doesn't create any particular too triggering of emotions. But really quickly, just to get started, let's do some housekeeping. And there's only one real housekeeping item. Your paper topics were released last 2 weeks ago almost. And they are due on Monday, April 13th. So you have one more week to work on your paper topics. Just so you know, office hours will be open today and open on Wednesday, and you can always have office hours with your TAs so that you can talk more about your paper. As the syllabus says, this paper is worth 20% of your grade, so make sure you put some effort into it. You have 3 topics to choose from, all of which kind of focus on the things that we've been talking about in the past couple weeks. So it shouldn't be too hard of an essay. Okay, so let's get into the meat of the lecture. So the guiding questions that we're going to be working with today follow from the questions that we didn't get to last week. So we're really going to be looking all week at how ethnicity actually becomes mobilized into conflict or violence. And today, specifically, as we focus on Rwanda, we're going to look at what the dominant ethnic patterns are in Rwanda, just to get some background about the topic. And then how do we explain ethnic violence in Rwanda, right? What happened to evolve ethnicity into violence in Rwanda? And how did we get to the mass genocide that happened in 1994? Apologies, I didn't have this in read mode before. Okay, so just to give you some quick background, though, remember that we had last class, we talked about what ethnicity was and what an ethnic group was. And we decided that ethnic groups were people who saw themselves as united based on their shared belief of a common ancestry or heritage and common descriptive traits. And we looked at race, language, religion, sometimes customs, and region as key markers of ethnicity. Well, based on that definition, there are actually a lot of ethnic groups in the world today. Some people claim that there are over 300 ethnic groups, and they span kind of the territory. Now, this is a very this isn't as expansive as it can get. This is just one measure that kind of groups them into big categories. But as you can see, there are tons of ethnic groups in society and in the world today. However, despite the fact that there are many ethnic groups, what we actually don't see is a very high incidence of ethnic conflict. Compared to just war onsets, which are somewhat plentiful, ethnic conflict onsets are actually pretty low over time. So there has never been in rather in the span of 1 year more than, I would say, probably 10 or 15 ethnic conflicts going on at the same time. So ethnic conflict itself is actually pretty rare given how many ethnicities we have that could potentially come into conflict with one another and compete over goods that could lead to violence. Nonetheless, one of the reasons that we study ethnic violence, and one of the reasons why it's so important, is because even though it's pretty rare, it's also pretty deadly. So if we look at death tolls in certain ethnic conflicts, we know that the Holocaust was a huge event in terms of the cost to human life. Over 5 million Jews killed during the Holocaust. But even in perhaps lesser known genocides and ethnic conflicts like the Cambodian genocide, the Armenian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, we still have more than a million people reported to be killed. In the smaller conflicts, we still have numbers up to 200,000, right? So those are huge numbers in terms of death tolls, cost to human life, and this doesn't even count the number of people that are displaced due to these conflicts, that are injured due to these conflicts. Oftentimes, women become the victims of sexual violence during these conflicts. So, the reason why we study this is because even though it doesn't happen that often, the consequences of the violence are actually quite devastating. And so, in general, political scientists have tried to learn kind of what is the cause of this ethnic violence and how is it that ethnicity that is kind of latent around the world becomes mobilized into conflict or becomes mobilized into these like huge genocidal episodes. And so last class, remember that we looked at how we understand ethnic attachments, and we had 5 different main theories for understanding why people attach to their ethnicity and what might happen to our ethnic attachments as time goes on. So we had modernization theory, which kind of posited that eventually, that ethnic attachments were a feature of the traditional man that eventually would wash away as we become more developed. Marxist theory believed that ethnic attachments were kind of a false consciousness, right? And that they would eventually give way to class consciousness. Primordialism, which saw ethnic attachments as ancient hatreds, right? The kind of latent fixed differences between different ethnicities that were not going to change and eventually might mobilize themselves into conflict. Instrumentalism, which thought that ethnicity was actually just kind of being used strategically to achieve other aims. And then finally, institutionalism, which looked at how the political system creates ethnic or makes ethnic differences between groups salient. And we saw that in the case of Malawi and Zambia, where 2 groups in a certain type of political system where they were big enough coalitions to win elections were rivals, right? Were electoral rivals. And in a situation where they weren't big enough to form a winning coalition, they were actually electoral partners. And so some of these theories actually not only help us understand what happens to ethnic attachments, but also help us to understand ethnic violence. Now, obviously, the first 2, modernization and Marxism, are not going to be helpful for this because they assume that ethnic attachments will eventually fade away, right? So that doesn't provide too much help as to how we're supposed to understand how this becomes mobilized into violence. But primordialism, instrumentalism, and institutionalism actually do provide us a little bit of leeway and a little bit of leverage as we're trying to understand how we get to violence. So for primordialism, the big thing is that ethnicity is fixed and unchanging, and it should always be salient. So as a Black woman, I'm always kind of cognizant of my Black identity. I know that it makes me different from other ethnic groups in the United States, in my territory. And to the extent that we should get ethnic violence, it's because the differences between myself and non-co-ethnics are permanent, right? And these differences, the fact that people look differently than I do, that they think differently than I do, that we have different preferences over what we want in politics, should be at the root of conflict. And so if a primordialist were looking at a conflict, for example, like the current conflict that is being waged between Palestinians and Israelis, they might look at that as, oh, there are just inherent differences between Jews and Arabs that make them want different things, right? They want their ethnic homeland to look a certain type of way. And that's really just not a conflict that we can resolve, right? Because they're always going to want these different things, and they always have wanted these different things. And so we're kind of stuck in this situation where Arabs are always going to oppose Jews, and there's no kind of resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, is that true? That's up for debate, but that is what a primordialist would say. Then we have instrumentalism as a possible theory for how we get to ethnic violence. And here, what they would say, again, ethnic identification is a strategic choice, right? We decide strategically to adopt certain ethnic identities or to express certain ethnic identities to achieve larger aims. In this case, ethnic identity, we get to violence because ethnic identity is manipulated by these people that they call ethnic entrepreneurs. So these are people like politicians, they can be businessmen, but they tend to be political elites who are trying to maximize their power. So if it's a politician, they're trying to get as many votes as possible. If it's a businessman, perhaps they're trying to get as much money as possible. And so that what they'll do is they'll make certain ethnic appeals, right? They'll appeal to a certain ethnic community in order to win their vote. And they'll really mobilize people around this ethnicity. And sometimes that can really lead to violence, right? Especially when you not only say great things about your ethnicity, but you denigrate another ethnicity in order to build up political support for your agenda. So in this case, ethnicity isn't really the problem, right? There's not really concrete ethnic differences between any group. But what these politicians and these ethnic entrepreneurs are doing is that they are using ethnicity strategically as a mask for some other thing that they want to achieve. So perhaps in a situation where the economy is tanking and an ethnic entrepreneur wants to build political support for herself, what she might do is to, say, for example, in the Holocaust, um, Hitler, during the period in which Germany's economy was not doing so well, Hitler specifically targeted Jews as the reason why Germans in general were facing such poor conditions, because Jews, according to him, were hoarding the money, etc. Now, did he really believe this? That is really up for debate. There's a famous picture of Hitler hugging a little Jewish girl that apparently, according to all sources, right, he knew this was a Jewish girl, right, and he's hugging her in a field, and it's really sweet picture. And so it's questionable whether he really hated Jews in his heart of hearts, or whether he was using kind of this false hatred of Jews in order to build political support for himself during a period in which Germany was not doing all that well. And then finally, institutionalism provides us some traction on how we're to understand ethnic violence. Here, ethnicity is made salient not by political entrepreneurs, but by political institutions. So the rules of the game that we decide on can determine how important ethnicity is to any given citizen. And so here, ethnic conflict is exacerbated by the institutional rules that we put in place and how the state mobilizes kind of around them, or in some cases, as we'll see in the case of India later on, how the state decides not to act about this. But in all of these cases, I think one of the important things to realize is that they are based in some type of grievance, right? Whether that grievance is real or whether that grievance is perceived. So for all of these theories, ethnic conflict tends to arise out of some type of form of resentment about inequalities between ethnic groups. And often when these inequalities are framed either politically or economically, we call this relative deprivation. So you can think of that in a chart like this, right? So here is what any ethnic group expects to gain, right? That they think they are entitled to. And when their actual attainment in terms of their living standards, in terms of their level of political equality, whatever it may be, is lower than that, this kind of gap between what they think they should have and what they actually have, or what others have and what this ethnic group has, is called relative deprivation. It's that gap that causes the grievance and that can really be mobilized into conflict. Now, I think what the theories disagree on is who is doing the mobilizing, right? Is that inherent to each of us as citizens? Is it political entrepreneurs that do this, or is it the political system itself? But kind of all of them are based in this idea of grievance. The other thing that's important to know is that ethnic conflict and grievances tend to be easier to mobilize around in what we call segmented societies, where the ethnic hierarchy is fixed and is embedded within the social or the political system. So we could consider a hierarchy like this, right? Which characterizes most of the Latin American world, but let's say Brazil, just for well, actually, since it's Spain, we can't say Brazil. Let's say Argentina then, for kicks. So at the bottom of this hierarchy, we have Blacks. Then there are indigenous persons, mestizo persons who are mix of Spanish and indigenous, Creoles who are Spanish of Spanish ancestry, but born in the colonial territory, and then what they called peninsulares, which are Spaniards who are born from Spain. And this is a pretty rigid hierarchy, right? You can't move levels of this hierarchy. And when society is segmented in this way, when there's not a lot of social mobility moving up and down, then these grievances tend to become seemingly fixed over time, right? That people believe that they are actually not only deprived relative to, like, for example, Blacks are not just deprived relative to Creoles, but they will be so for life. And that can cause ethnic tension and ethnic competition to really blow up into big conflicts, because you have to do something extreme like violence to rectify the situation and to reorder this hierarchy. So then with this, we have our three theories on hand. We have institutionalism, instrumentalism, and primordialism. And what we're going to do for the rest of this lecture is see how this applies in a specific case, and that would be the case of Rwanda. And we're going to do this all throughout the next three lectures. We're going to look at different cases and try to figure out what is motivating violence in these cases. So if you don't know a lot about Rwanda is a small country. It looks big here, but it's actually really, really tiny in kind of central East Africa. And it was victim to a civil war in the 1990s. It's been victim to ethnic violence throughout its kind of even its pre-independence history, but surely in its post-independence history. But in the 1990s, it was victim to a civil war that raged between two ethnic groups, Hutu and Tutsi. And in 1994, a mass genocide sparked in April of 1994, lasted from April to about July, that claimed the lives of at least 500,000, if not a million, Tutsi and moderate Hutu, and was one of the greatest genocides since the Holocaust that we've seen in the modern day. So just to give a little background on this, it's useful to think about who are the actors in this conflict. And so the Hutu and the Tutsi are the two main actors, but we're going to figure out, like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be Hutu? What does it mean to be Tutsi? So Rwanda is actually comprised of three main ethnicities. So the Tutsi are kind of these taller, they're slightly taller individuals, thinner faces, etc. The Hutu are slightly shorter, and then the Twa, which are kind of like a very short, almost pygmy-like people. So we have these three main ethnicities: Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa, and they are in different proportions in the population. So Hutus are the dominant population in, at least numerically dominant population in Rwanda. They comprise anywhere from 90 to about 85% of the population at any given point in time. In 1985, they were 90% of the population. Tutsi, a small minority, somewhere between about 9 and 15% of the population, and then Twa are actually very small, usually around 1 to 3% of the population. So we have three different ethnic groups in three radically different proportions. But there is debate about what the actual difference between these ethnic groups are, and is there any substantive ethnic difference between the two? On the one hand, some people believe that there is an actual racial difference between the two, and that's what defines a Hutu versus a Tutsi. On the other hand, some people believe that there is no racial difference. It's more of a class difference between the two groups. And then a third kind of theory suggests that really it's just a political difference, right? It's a constructed difference based on the political system that was put in place in pre-colonial times. And so we're going to go through each of these explanations just to get a sense of what might be the kind of latent differences between these two groups. So on the one hand, some people think that there is an actual phenotypical racial difference between Hutu and Tutsi, or genetic difference between Hutu and Tutsi. So people think that these are separate ethnic groups. They have different ancestry, so they would be genetically separate from one another. And the common belief, surely during the pre-colonial and colonial period, was that Tutsi were actually racially superior to Hutus, and that they might have a kind of natural enmity with Hutus, right? That they're going to be kind of against Hutus in general. And the reasons for this was just kind of based on general phenotypic difference. Now, some of you may look at this and say, I really can't tell the difference between these groups, but the top six are Hutu individuals, bottom six Tutsi individuals at the top six, and Hutu individuals on the bottom six. And generally what people thought is that Tutsi had much more kind of Caucasian features, right? They had longer heads, they tended to be taller, they had more narrow noses. It's kind of if you know anything about genetics, it's kind of like a Nubian phenotype, right? There were kind of rumors that they might be related to Nubians and Kushites from Egypt, whereas Hutu were kind of more broad-nosed. Again, they were shorter. Some people suggested that they might have darker skin. It wasn't that much darker, but and so people began to believe that these two were genetically different groups, and this was typically in the colonial period proven by things like phrenology. Again, you saw the picture of someone checking the distance between someone's nose and forehead, things like that. But the problem with this is that there is no real genetic difference between the two. If you took the genes of a Hutu and a Tutsi, they would not be genetically different. And also there was a high incidence of intermarriage that made it very difficult to tell who exactly was Tutsi and who exactly was Hutu. There was so much intermarriage that any phenotypic differences often came out in the wash. And we can kind of see that through survey research. So it happened to be the case that a lot of people, about 68%, had family that were either Hutu members or Tutsi members. So there was a lot of intermarriage. Almost 98% of people said that they would marry a Hutu person if they were Tutsi, or allow their child to do so. They had very neighborly relations, right? So Hutu and Tutsi often lived amongst one another before the genocide. And they also had positive opinions of one another, right? So the interethnic relations were actually quite high, and people had a positive opinion along either side of the ethnic divide. So there may have been some difference, but it probably wasn't substantive enough for anyone to be able to really tell the difference other than by knowing the person. Another theory suggests that there might have been a class difference between these two groups. And here it was mainly focused around the different jobs that the groups had. So although Hutu and Tutsi were considered ethnically similar, they might have been in separate social classes, such that Tutsi were the wealthy pastoralists. They engaged in cattle herding, things like this, whereas Hutu were poorer and they were agriculturalists. So they were the ones who grew most of the crops. And this is actually true, right? This is how society ended up lining up economically, with the Tutsi being the people who were doing all of the cattle herding, etc. But the problem with this is that there is actual social mobility among Hutu and Tutsi. So in the hierarchy, I place this dotted line here because there was actually an opportunity for Hutu, if they got enough money, if they got property, if they got cattle, to move up to basically what they call to kwihatura, which is to shed your Hutu-ness and move up in the Tutsi, move up in the racial hierarchy and basically assume Tutsi-ness. On the other hand, if a Tutsi had lost his property, he would be a Gusupira, which means that he would lose his status as a Tutsi and kind of shift down to the lower class. So there may have been class differences. There were class differences between the two, but that didn't impede social mobility such that Hutu could basically become less Hutu and end up assimilating into Tutsi ranks, and Tutsi could become less Tutsi and kind of lower down to the Hutu rank. And then finally, some scholars believe that the real difference between these groups is just a constructed one that was made by the political system. And this has a lot of substance in the literature and in the historical record. So again, Hutu and Tutsi in this kind of view are ethnically similar, and these are socially malleable categories, but the differences became very rigid because they were politicized in the pre-colonial and colonial practices. And so one of those practices was the administrative hierarchy. So if we look at this triangle here, one thing that we'll notice is that Tutsi tended to occupy most of the high positions in the administration in both colonial and pre-colonial in Rwanda. So Tutsi tended to be the kings. All kings in pre-colonial Rwanda were Tutsi in origin. They tended to dominate the chieftainships, and because they had cattle, they tended to be the more well-off. So they were the aristocrats. Whereas Hutu were kind of just regular citizens, right? They ended up being the lower middle class, and then Twa were extremely impoverished, ended up being potters. So there were some administrative differences such that Tutsi held most of the political positions and Hutu were largely shut out in the pre-colonial and colonial period. There were also other practices that tended to kind of reify differences between these two groups, one of which was called Uburitwa. And what Uburitwa was is basically a system of forced labor in which primarily Hutu would live on someone else's land as basically a sharecropper, and they would have to engage in days of forced labor in order to pay for living on this land, right? And so this was a practice that pretty much only applied to Hutu, those people who were doing the sharecropping instead of owning the land. And this also kind of increased the differences between the two, that Hutu were the types of people that engaged in forced labor, and Tutsi were the type of people who ruled over them in this system. And note that these racial differences were only increased and strengthened and solidified under the colonial regime. So once colonists came in, particularly Belgian colonists, what they did is they began to institutionalize this difference by handing out racial identity cards. And if you can see, you might have to zoom in here, but here it actually states the ethnicity of the person. It crosses out Hutu, it crosses out Twa, she's actually Tutsi. And people would have to carry these around as a way of signifying what ethnicity they were. They also ramped up Tutsi representation in the administrative system and the colonial administrative system. So 45 out of 45 chiefs, so all of the chiefs in Rwanda were Tutsi, and 550 544 out of 559 sub-chiefs were also of Tutsi origin. So in general, the administration is dominated by Tutsi again. And then Uburitwa, which used to be kind of an informal practice, became legally mandated at 42 days a year for every Hutu that was living on someone's land. So we see these differences, actually, these ethnic differences harden and become a part of the political system under colonialism. So then how do we get to genocide from this? Well, you can kind of see some of the reasons why people might have conflicts just based on the kind of institutionalized racial differences that we see between Hutus and Tutsis. But actually, the story of genocide becomes much more kind of virulent, or much more becomes much more stark after independence. So Rwanda gets its independence in the early 1960s, but as a condition of independence, what former colonialists required is that they become a democracy, right? That they institutionalize democratic rule. But remember that the racial demography of Rwanda was such that Hutus were the vast majority of the population. So if in fact we instituted majority democratic rule, we would have a reversion of the political system, right? That Hutu, in fact, would dominate the political system and not Tutsi, and they would be able to elect parties that represent Hutu. And that's exactly what happened. When independence was achieved, we got the rise of a Hutu-based party, the Parma Hutu, under the rule of Kayibanda. And what this party set out to do once it achieved power was to reverse the racial hierarchy that had ruled Rwanda for so long. So on the one hand, they did continue to legally codify ethnic differences between the groups, but they basically shifted the hierarchy such that Hutu were the ones who were going to have all of the administrative positions, the military positions, and the political positions. So whereas the hierarchy used to have Tutsi at the top, Tutsi are now in the middle, Hutu are at the top, and there's no flexibility here. You cannot shed your identity and move upwards or move downwards. This is a very rigid and strict, as we saw before, segmented hierarchy between these two groups. In order to create some type of economic justice, Tutsi land, because these were mostly the landowners, was expropriated and redistributed to Hutu populations. And many Tutsis during this process of kind of reversing the racial hierarchy were killed or displaced. And many of them went either southward towards Burundi, that also had a kind of Hutu Tutsi population, and several went northward into Uganda and began to organize politically in these two places. So independence kind of caused a big uproar and a spate of violence around Hutu and Tutsi ethnicity. But another spate of violence actually happened around the 1970s, 1980s, with the ascension of a new president to power. So Juvenal Habyarimana came to power in 1973, and he was initially kind of praised as a person who would be a great reformer. He was a moderate Hutu, so in the kind of middle of the political spectrum, and he originally kind of came to power on a platform of incorporating Tutsi more cleanly into politics. So he was going to abolish any quotas that would prevent Tutsi from accessing administrative positions. And he began to do this and allow them to get more power in certain fields like education and medicine, etc. But in 1978, or in the 1970s rather, in 1974, this led to a big backlash among some of his supporters, and particularly followers of his wife, who was a much more extremist Hutu. And so in 1978, he reimposed these policies that were biased against Tutsi and in favor of Hutu, and created an authoritarian one-party state ruled by Hutu government. So here we have the system kind of changing for a bit, but coming back. And this would have probably lasted for quite some time had it not been for the problem that most sub-Saharan African countries got into, which was declining revenues. The price of coffee, which is what one of Rwanda's greatest exports, declined in the 1980s, and so we saw a drop off in their GDP per capita. And in the midst of kind of this economic instability, backers of the Rwandan regime, like the French, this is Francois Mitterrand, suggested that Rwanda actually transition from an authoritarian one-party state to a democracy. And so that is what happened. There was kind of a statement by Habyarimana in July, I believe, of 1990, that there was going to be an official transition to multi-party democracy in Rwanda, that we were going to incorporate more Tutsi into the political system, and that we would marginalize those hardliners that were pushing for anti-Tutsi law. And these people were called the Akazu, and they were represented again by Habyarimana's wife, Agathe, who we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, what this did, you would think that this would kind of ease ethnic tension and violence, but what this actually did is cause those Tutsi that had moved to Uganda, who had moved to Burundi, to see a political opportunity, particularly as it took a long time to start this transition. Tutsi that were living in exile got super upset about how long it was taking to actually make this transition, and decided, okay, this is the perfect opportunity to try to gain power for ourselves by engaging in limited warfare with Rwanda. And so what we saw is the kind of creation of what they called the Rwandan Patriotic Front. These were a group of Tutsi exiles who were living in Uganda, and they created this militia army that was meant to launch attacks against the Rwandan government in order to gain more power for Tutsi, such that when the transition for democracy came, they could get more power in the political system. Unsurprisingly, what this led to was a civil war. So from 1990 to 1993, there was a kind of years-long civil war between Hutu and Tutsi. Hutu militias rose up against these Tutsi militias that were coming in and spreading guerrilla warfare. And it led to several displacements, several deaths over the course of those 3 years. But this is not the genocide, so it actually gets worse, unfortunately. So in 1993, there was a solution to deal with this called the Arusha Accord. So people came together to try and put an end to violence. There was a ceasefire. And so what they agreed to was that ministerial posts would be shared between Hutu and Tutsi, that the Rwandan Patriotic Front, this group of Tutsis, would be integrated into the National Assembly, and that the RPF would be integrated into the army as well. And again, you might have thought that this would have eased conflict between the two, right? We get a negotiated peace agreement, and it very well may have, except that one terrible thing happens in April of 1993. That year, Juvenal Habyarimana and the Hutu president of Burundi are flying in a plane, and that plane gets shot down. Now, who shot the plane down is still a matter of debate. Some people think that it is members of the RPF who wanted to ruin the peace accords. Some people think it's members of those hardliner Hutus who also had incentives to ruin the peace accords. But in either case, the plane gets shot down. Habyarimana and the Hutu president of Burundi are assassinated, and they die. And so we get a reignition of the violence due to this horrific event. And this is how we get to the Rwandan genocide. So for 3 months following the assassination of Habyarimana, over 500,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu are killed over the span of 3 months. And just to kind of give you a quick trigger warning, I'm going to show a little video to show you the extent of the violence here. So let's pull this up. So what we saw is that Hutu militias would come together, they would roam the streets of Rwanda, and they would basically go into Tutsi homes and violently kind of kill Tutsis, and also moderate Hutus, those who cooperated or collaborated with Tutsis, with machetes. This is kind of the most bland version of the violence. If you kind of listen to the reports from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, people were hacked up with machetes, dismembered. There's all sorts of violence, but like this is what cities began to look like, right? People killed on the side of the street, people coming into their homes, and these were Hutu militias that were enacting most of this violence. However, it wasn't just state militias that were doing this. Another kind of group that was involved, the violence ultimately expands across Rwanda. And in part, that is because civilian armies became involved. So it wasn't just the Rwandan army itself, but civilian armies became involved in the violence, and they were encouraged by state media and propaganda. So a magazine that was popular during the time was this Kangura magazine, again funded by people from the Hutu extremists, and they often presented negative propaganda about Tutsis. So they would have these kind of offensive political cartoons. They would refer to them as ayinzi, which meant cockroaches, right? They would refer to them as things like rats to try to dehumanize them. And even on the radio, this radio station called the Thousand Hills Free Radio, that was sponsored by Hutu extremists, would basically put out hate speech, right, and give directives to Hutu citizens to kill Tutsi. So one of the things they would say is cut the tall grass, referring to the taller stature of Tutsis, telling them to kill them. One particularly sobering broadcast said, something to the effect of go out and kill Tutsis, the graves are not yet full, right? And so they were giving specific directives to engage in genocide. And in fact, that is when we saw violence explode. As civilian armies began to go to their neighbors' houses, to go through their villages and kill Tutsi and moderate Hutu, we saw violence expand throughout the Rwandan territory. So what explains ethnic violence in this case? Well, there's evidence for kind of all of the theories that we've looked at thus far. On the one hand, ethnic hatred and fear seems to be particularly prevalent, and I'll show you a little video that kind of evidences this on YouTube. So let's see.
As the UN debated whether to keep a peacekeeping force in Kigali, the extremist Hutu leadership implemented the next phase of its plan: to spread the killing across the nation by exploiting Rwanda's culture of obedience. They told Hutus the Tutsi rebels were foreign invaders bent on turning them into slaves. Their propaganda reminded Hutus that the Tutsis had ruled them for centuries, often treating them with disdain.
Tutsis used to abuse Hutus. For example, if a Tutsi chief wished to stand up from his chair, he would call up a Hutu who would allow his foot to be pierced by the Tutsi's spear as he stood up. My understanding is that Tutsis are not originally from Rwanda. I heard that they might have come from Egypt or somewhere else.
So there is evidence from that clip we can see of ethnic hatred and fear. And in fact, an anthropologist who did research on Rwanda suggested in his book that Rwandan society was in fact profoundly racist. There was an image of Tutsi as inherently evil, exploitative, and that has been rooted in the psyche of Rwandans. So even though there may not be kind of a latent ethnic hatred between the two, there are not really latent ethnic differences between the two groups, there was definitely a perceived difference between the two groups, right? As you saw in the documentary, this Tutsi man believed that these were foreign invaders, that these people had not actually come from Rwanda, that they and knew that there was this history of abuse between the two groups, and this helped to fuel some of the violence in that case. There's also evidence of an instrumental explanation of the violence. Looking at political players in the violence, again, I mentioned that Habyarimana's wife, Agat, um, was particularly extremist and funded a lot of extremist Hutu groups. The Akazu kind of built around her. Also, a high military officer, Bagore, was involved in funding some of the propaganda efforts, funding the Thousand Hills radio station, and engaging in the violence. So these are the types of political elites that were kind of uh, inciting Hutu citizens to violence in this case. And in fact, the testimonies that came out during the period of the trial, the reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, attest to this, right? So an anonymous Tutsi suggested that it was politics. Politicians told people to kill, and you would be able to get your neighbor's good land. So, right. So for politicians, this was a matter of getting more support for themselves. But even for individuals, this was not really about ethnicity. It was about gaining something, right? Gaining, in this case, economic goods. Testimony given by Allison Dess suggests that uh, politicians were offering incentives to people who were poor and telling them that if they were in fact to kill people, they would loot. They could loot their things, and they would eventually get the land and businesses of their victims. So people would go around, particularly targeting violence against those who had goods to take. So refrigerators, sofas, radios, etc., and assailants would get their rewards. So here, the argument would be that it wasn't really about ethnicity. It was about the fact that Hutu did not have a lot of money, that they wanted to get the goods of richer Tutsi that existed, and so they engaged in violence in order to do that, right? In order to achieve these economic ends. Institutions also have some explanation, and as you might be able to tell from this lecture, I'm kind of biased in favor of an institutional explanation. Again, we saw that there was a very strict hierarchy implemented after independence, with the Hutu on the top and the Tutsi on the bottom, and this was reified through things like ethnic identity cards and the positions within the administrative hierarchy. But even the state itself was actually involved in the violence. So the Interhamwe was a youth militia of the dominant party in Rwanda at the time, the dominant Hutu party at the time, and they were used to perpetrate violence against Tutsis during the Rwandan genocide. So these were part of the state bands, like the state directed bands that would go and kill Tutsis during this genocide, go from village to village. And the Human Rights Watch reports attest to this, right? They say that civilian groups were specifically led by local administrators and militias attached to the party, and they would go around and destroy crops and steal food and burn homes and attack people. And again, the radio played a really big role in this, right? The state-owned radio was the way through which people got out these messages of hate, got out these messages to individual Hutu citizens to kill, and was the reason why violence was able to be spread so widely across Rwanda at the time. So we can see that, these should be flipped, but here is the Hutu Power radio transmission, and we can see that there is a bit of a correlation just kind of visually between where radio signals went and where violence happened to be. right? So it is very clear that state institutions, whether it be their military institutions, their political institutions, their kind of social institutions as far as their hierarchical system, or things like the state radio, actually did help to incentivize and incite violence in this case. One last thing that I think I would be remiss if I didn't bring up was the role of international inaction, and not necessarily starting the genocide, but surely failing to stop it. Um, One of the real detractors of the Clinton regime is that he did not, the Clinton administration, as well as other foreign administrations, did not really take this genocide as seriously as it should have been, despite reports on the ground that this was going to happen months before it began. And the Clinton administration in particular was unwilling to use the term genocide because that would basically obligate the United States to come in. And to give finally a sense of how bad this was, again, I'm going to go to the documentary, which I think is really cool. I think you should watch it in full, but I'll give you a sense of how bad this actually got.
All Western troops and UN peacekeepers were under orders not to evacuate ordinary Rwandans.
What that meant was anybody that was white-skinned got to get on an airplane and fly to safety, and anybody that was black-skinned got to stay in Rwanda and get killed. And that's as simple as it came down to. It still to this day leaves a very, very bad taste in my mouth that the United States of America could have 350 Marines sitting at Bujumbura Airport, that the French were able to get in 500 or so paratroopers, that the Belgians had over 1,000 paratroopers. We basically had our intervention force already on the ground. What they later told us it was impossible to get on the ground. We had it on the ground on the 10th of April, within 3 days of this thing starting. And, but it wasn't there to intervene. It wasn't there to save Rwandans. It was there to save white people. And that's what it came down to.
So surely, as the clip kind of makes very clear, the inability or the decision not to intervene to stop the genocide, but rather to get people out, get expatriates out of the situation, is one of the reasons why the violence was able to exist for so long, right? To go for 3 months when it could have possibly been stopped in the month of April, and why the death toll was so large. So the food for thought that I want you to consider is, which explanation of ethnic violence do you find most convincing? So kind of looking at the case, doing the reading, listening to the lecture, what do you think actually explains ethnic violence in this case? And that is kind of the food for thought that I'm going to leave you with as we go into all of our cases. So for next time, we're going to focus on ethnic conflict in Yugoslavia and India. And I would just say do the readings. Whatever you've been assigned in section, make sure you do that, and look at it with the lens of how are we going to explain the violence that happened in this case. Again, it was lovely to talk to you despite the sobering topic, and I'll see you next class. Bye.